Hi, everyone. Welcome to Global Fact 8. Our second session of the day is about global trends shaping the fact-checking movement. This is based on a deep and comprehensive dive into claim review data. And frankly, this is a global fact panel that's long overdue. Since the claim review standard was first proposed, really since it was just a gleam in the eye of Bill Adair and a few other people, one of the great promises of having a universal data standard for fact checks was that it would give us the ability to aggregate fact checking work in real time and get a picture of who was being fact checked, what was being fact checked around the world, of where fact checking was taking place in a really unique way. That never happened, at least not at scale, until one master's student in Antwerp was looking for a thesis idea, and he hit upon the idea of diving into 5 years of claim review data. That was Thomas van Damme, and the result is a fascinating and comprehensive picture of the last 5 years of fact-checking around the world, which Thomas is about to share the highlights of with all of us. Thomas has also, just a few weeks ago, defended to great acclaim his thesis, and that's been published. At least it's available online. And I really encourage anyone who's interested in this to go ahead and read the thesis. It's very readable, and for fact checkers and those involved in this movement, it really is a fascinating overview of how this movement's changing. So Thomas is going to give us an overview of some of the highlights of the data for the next 15 minutes or so, and then we'll talk about them in a roundtable format before segueing to some questions from the audience. We have a great panel. We've got Karen Rebelo, the deputy editor of Boom Live, which is an organization that really embodies a lot of the changes that are revealed, a lot of the shifts that are revealed in the data. We've got, hopefully, if we resolve some tech issues, we've got the person most intimately involved in making claim review useful for fact checkers day to day, and that's Joel Luther of the Duke Reporters Lab. And unfortunately, we aren't able to have, it appears, Schema.org's Dan Brickley, but we're looking forward to a great conversation. And again, that starts with the presentation from Thomas. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Lucas, for that great introduction. So as Lucas said, for my master's thesis at the University of Antwerp, the overarching theme was basically, well, we have had claim review for 5 years now. Apparently, quite a lot of fact-checking organizations are using this structured data standard. We know that tech platforms are using it to use in their products. But what might we, as fact-checking researchers and fact-checking practitioners, gain from systematically analyzing and compiling this data? So with that said, I'd just like to share some of the trends which emerged. But before that, so the data compilation was obviously the first step of the process. And as I said, the main source of data were these claim review entries. And so for those who do not know, claim review entries are basically short summaries of fact checks. So they state the organization that did the fact check, the claim which they fact checked, who made the claim, when and where was the claim made, and then finally the conclusions of the fact checker. So is that claim true or false? After compiling those claim review entries, I also added some complementary data sources which provide more information about the fact checking organizations themselves. So information such as, where are those organizations based? Are they code of principle signatories, and are they Facebook partners? The pipeline here seems relatively simple, but I can say that this whole process from scraping the data, compiling it, extracting the variables, and so forth, took about 4 months of full-time work. And the main reason for that is that claim review data in its raw form is actually quite messy, and maybe that's something we can go into a bit more during the discussion. So just to give you an idea of the data, in total, the database contains around 110,000 fact checks from 134 recognized fact-checking organizations. who are based in 57 different countries, and they span a 5-year period between 2016 and 2020. So clearly, not all fact-checking organizations are using ClaimReview. So the first question is, how representative is this data really for the fact-checking movement as a whole? And that's quite a complex question to answer, but just to give a basic idea, these 134 overarching fact-checking organizations collectively represent about 58% of all fact-checking teams which are in the Duke census, about 70% of all COP signatories, and about 78% of all Facebook partners. And it's also worth pointing out that of the 42% of organizations in the Duke census which do not use ClaimReview, most of those are either quite small or very recent projects. So with a few notable exceptions, almost all of the larger established fact-checking organizations do use ClaimReview. So I think in general, this data is actually a pretty good reflection of trends within the larger movement over these 5 years. So going to this first slide, what we see here is the number of fact checks submitted to ClaimReview by each organization. And what's immediately clear is that while a lot of organizations use ClaimReview, some clearly publish a lot more ClaimReview entries than others. And so in fact, the 12 largest contributors to ClaimReview have published more than half of the total of ClaimReview entries. And put another way, the 70 smallest contributors have collectively published fewer entries than the single largest contributor, namely AFP. The next slide shows the number of ClaimReview entries over time, sorted by the continent in which the fact checkers are based. And so one thing that's first very apparent is that the number of ClaimReview entries has really grown exponentially over the past 5 years. But secondly, I think what's worth pointing out is the enormous share of fact checks coming from Asia. So while initially fact checkers from North America and then later Europe were providing the majority of ClaimReview entries, in the past years, Asian fact checkers have really started to dominate the database. And so even though the academic literature focuses quite heavily on North American and European fact checkers, I think Asian fact checkers deserve more attention. And in fact, for 2020, over half of all fact checks in the database were submitted by Asian fact checkers. If we then look at the specific countries in which these fact checkers are based, it's clear that a lot of this is due to fact checks from India. And likewise, in many other continents, we see that fact checking is quite concentrated in a single country. So that would be in the United States for North America, in Brazil for South America. And meanwhile, Europe also has a lot of fact checks in the dataset, but these are more dispersed across the continent, so coming from different countries. And finally, of course, there are still a lot of countries in the world which do not have a fact-checking organization which is using ClaimReview. However, that picture changes a bit.
And I know that we'll try to bring him back since this data is really the highlight that we're going to be talking about. While we're doing that, maybe we can start to talk about the shifts that we're already seeing in this data. One of the major changes in the global picture of fact checking that's revealed in Thomas's analysis is how much the center of gravity moved from the and Europe to a lesser degree to Asia, and especially to India. That's one of the two really striking trends, and hopefully we'll have a chance to go over the second one after Thomas comes back. But that raises an important question, right? This is still a conversation, as Thomas noted, the global conversation around fact-checking among NGOs, among academics, and in the movement is still often centered on the United States and on Europe. So does the conversation need to change in order to catch up to this shift to Asia? And what challenges or opportunities does this shift bring for the movement as a whole? And Karen, it's so great that we've got you on the panel. Boom Live has contributed, a lot to the we're just looking at. So I wonder what you think about that. I wonder if you think that our conversation about fact checking needs to catch up to the reality of where it's happening today.
Yeah, anecdotally, we know that's true. So, I mean, everyone in this part of the world, I've always felt that fact checkers in Asia have been really busy over the past 5 years, and you see that reflected in the data as well. And there are so many reasons for that to happen. So, if Thomas was presenting from his data looked at 2016 to 2020, and that's such a crucial time period. That the fact-checking movement has seen in Asia. So if I look at some of the reasons for why that's happened, one is, of course, it's a no-brainer that misinformation is like a huge problem in this region of the world. And there are a number of factors for that. The other thing is, if you look at tech platforms, which are the primary vehicles of misinformation, their largest markets or their growth markets are in India. So, for example, a WhatsApp, its largest market is India. And out of its 2 billion users, over 400 million are in India. So, even from that perspective, if you look at it, it makes sense. The third one, which I think Thomas's thesis mentions, is that the number of languages over here. So if you look at the expansion of fact-checking, particularly in India over the past 5 years, you can see fact-checking, sort of expand into a number of regional languages. That's not just in India, but all of Asia as well. If you look at all of those three factors, I think, it sort of explains why that is. India in particular is, unique in a number of ways. So what happened in 2015 and 2016 is that you had a new telecom player enter this market, Reliance Jio, which is a company owned by India's richest man, Mukesh Ambani. And what that did was that literally plunged mobile internet rates in the country. So all of a sudden, between that time period, like say from 2016 onwards, you had some of the lowest mobile tariffs in the country, which made it possible for millions of people to come online for the first time. Now, in this scenario, their first introduction to the internet is WhatsApp, is YouTube. And a lot of these people cannot discern, they don't have the media literacy to discern what is fact from what is fake. And I think if you look at all of these factors, and it's a confluence of all of those factors which has resulted into such a robust movement where you have so many fact checkers in Asia.
Facebook partnership and the amount of resources that Facebook has invented together in Asia and especially in India has contributed to that growth over the last 3 years, especially.
Yes, I would think that is fair to say. If you look at, just in terms of the 3 PFCs of Facebook's partnership that it has globally, so it has the most number of partners, I think, in the US, and India is second. This makes sense because its universe of products is, India is its main market, like, for example, what I said with regards to WhatsApp. But also the partners that Facebook is onboarding, they are expanding into other Indian languages. So English is a very small sliver of the fact checking pie that that first kickstarted all of this.
And Joel, you have a unique picture of this. I think we have Thomas back. I don't know if we're quite ready for the presentation, but we're ready. Okay, we're waiting on the presentation. Joel, in the meantime, we can round out actually our discussion of this trend. You also have, you have pretty good perch from which to see how the organizations using ClaimReview and contributing ClaimReview coded fact checks have changed over the last years. You've also been, a central figure in this movement for the last few years. How do you think that conferences like this one and the global movement as a whole needs to shift to reflect the changing composition of the fact-checking community? Okay, I think we're ready to go with the presentation. It's coming up. A few more seconds, it's loading.
Okay. I hope this is more or less where I left off. So wait. One sec. Yeah. All right. So as I was saying, the view changes a bit when you switch to looking at which countries are actually mentioned in these ClaimReview entries. So as we can see here, countries like China are receiving quite a lot of attention from fact checkers, even though they don't have their own fact-checking organizations. And I think what's most notable about this view is that by 2020, essentially every country and region in the world had been fact-checked by fact-checkers at least once. So I think that's a pretty big accomplishment. Next, I didn't only want to see, which countries are being mentioned, but also what topics are being discussed by fact-checkers. Is my view adapting? No. Okay, there we go. So to do that, I basically concatenated the relevant fields from ClaimReview and then sent those ClaimReview entries to IBM Watson, which then returned a category label for each of those entries. So we could see, what is being discussed. Is it politics? Is it health? Is it religion? And so forth. And what we can see in 2020 is that there's two clear spikes in fact-checking. One related to health and one related to politics. And of course, as one would expect, those are, the coronavirus and the US elections attracting a lot of attention from fact checkers. But I think what's most notable about this is that even though these two topics generated immense extra work for fact checkers, overall ClaimReview output in 2020 more than doubled compared to 2019. And as a result, those two topics did not go at the expense of other fact-checking categories. So to give you an idea, on average in 2019, about 2,300 fact checks were submitted on ClaimReview each month, whereas in 2020, that was about 5,000 fact checks per month. And to put that in perspective, that means that in 2020, each month, more fact checks were added than were added in the entire year of 2016. Moving on. Another way to look at the different categories is to examine which words frequently co-occur together across these ClaimReview entries. And that creates some topic clusters. And what's interesting here is that most of these clusters are quite regional. So this is the India cluster, this is the US cluster, this is the Brazil cluster. But perhaps unsurprisingly, the COVID cluster is a topic which is discussed across the whole world. And I think that creates an interesting opportunity for researchers to see, how is the same topic, and in some cases even the very same claim, being discussed differently by different fact checkers in different parts of the world. Then I also wanted to assess which share of ClaimReview entries were coming from Facebook partners. So as you can see here, the yellow ClaimReview entries are entries which were submitted by non-Facebook partners. And then in dark blue are entries submitted by active Facebook partners. And of course, the clearest conclusion from that is that at this point, entries from Facebook partners represent a very significant share of all entries in the ClaimReview database. This increasing dominance of Facebook partners in the dataset reflects several things. First of all, it reflects the fact that Facebook fact checkers on average publish a lot more claim review entries than other organizations. And that is due to the fact that some of those organizations have always been bigger, such as PolitiFact. But in other cases, it also reflects the fact that the funding which Facebook provides is allowing certain organizations to really expand their fact-checking work significantly. And we see that especially in India. And another reason for this growing dominance of Facebook partners is, of course, that the program itself is expanding both to new organizations, but also to new countries. And so on this map, we see the Facebook partnerships across the world. And what's clear is that this includes many countries which don't, in fact, have their own fact-checking organizations. And the reason for that is, of course, that within the Facebook program, a lot of fact-checking organizations have a mandate to check Facebook content in multiple countries. And I think that is really, in a sense, showing that the Facebook partnership is kind of nudging fact-checkers to expand their activities into countries which previously had no fact-checkers. But it's also stimulating the development of a new type of fact-checking organization. So whereas traditionally fact-checkers have been seen as national entities working on a national scope, increasingly we are seeing organizations which do transnational, regional, or even global work. And the most clear-cut example of that is AFP, which within the Facebook program, AFP is responsible for no less than 86 countries. A parallel trend that emerges is that we can see that there are significantly more and more claim review entries which mention some type of social media platform as the place where the claim originated. So whereas this was a very small percentage of all the fact checks in 2016, by 2020, about 2/3 of all fact checks mention social media as the source of the claim. And it's tempting to draw a direct conclusion between Facebook fact checking and this growing social media fact checking. But in fact, that same trend is almost as pronounced for non-Facebook partners. Although non-Facebook partners do more frequently check Twitter, whereas Facebook partners generally check Facebook more often. And what's not shown on this slide is that over the same period, the number of entries which mention a distinct claimant, which is a politician or a public figure or an institution, has drastically declined. So in 2016, those distinct claimants represent about 50% of all claim review entries, whereas now in 2020, it's less than 10%. And I think those two trends combined really show that, by and large, the fact-checking movement is switching its focus from political fact-checking or holding politicians accountable to more social media fact-checking, so verifying the accuracy of viral online rumors. A trend that goes hand in hand with that is that there are ever greater numbers of visual fact checks. So for this analysis, I basically looked at whether the claim review entry mentioned some kind of visual format in their claim review entry. So that could be an image, picture, a meme, a video. And again, here we see that the proportion of such fact checks has grown quite a lot. So that indicates that the new MediaReview data standard will be very useful for a significant portion of fact checks published today. One trend that has declined drastically over the past 5 years is the average fact check rating. So basically, I went through all the entries and assigned them a standardized rating on a scale from 1 to 5. 1 being false and 5 being true. And so whereas in 2016, the average rating was about half true or half false, in 2020, the average rating is somewhere between false and mostly false. And that, first of all, reflects, I think, that transition to social media fact-checking, because if we are checking a claim on social media, it's generally because that claim contains misinformation, so it's likely to receive a bad score. But it also reflects the fact that organizations which have started using claim review more recently seem to be focusing more on claims which are likely false, whereas organizations which adopted claim review early try to strike more of a balance between claims which are likely false and claims which are likely true. Finally, a bit of a claim first appearing and then the fact checkers publishing their findings about that claim. And so despite all the talk about automation and improving the efficiency of fact-checking, we can see that the number of days to fact check a claim has remained relatively constant at around 4 days. And that trend is remains very consistent throughout the dataset. So it doesn't matter if you look at different continents or at Facebook partners or non-Facebook partners, it's always around 4 days on average to fact check a claim. So in conclusion, what I've tried to show with these charts is that ClaimReview can really help us zoom out and get a sort of bird's eye view of the movement, and that it's not just a tool for platform companies to use, but it's also a really valuable resource for us as researchers, but also for you guys as fact checkers to inform the policies that we make, the strategies that we develop. And I really hope that this analysis shows how useful that data can be, and that other people try and pursue and work with this data. As it is, the data is pretty messy to work with. It's often frustrating, but I think in the end, that effort is worth it, and we can get some really valuable insights. To conclude, as Lucas said, if you want more information on this, including the various trends discussed, but also some of the limitations of the data, the methodology, and so forth, my thesis is now online on academia. I've also published all of the dashboards which I've shown on Tableau Public. So there you can interact with the data yourself, maybe look at your specific organization or your country and how that features in those charts. And finally, if anybody has any suggestions or ideas what to do with the data, or just questions about this process, then feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. That's such a fascinating and revealing picture of the global movement. And we're going to try to keep the slides up on the screen during our discussion so that we can pull up relevant pictures. First, very quickly, can we just have an audio check from you, Joel?
Yeah. Hey, how's it going?
Fantastic. It's so good to hear your voice.
Great.
So we already talked about the sort of shift to Asia. There's another really dramatic, well, there's two other really dramatic findings that come through, trends that come through in this data. One is, of course, the increased output and how well the community has responded to the challenge of misinformation around COVID. We'll talk about that in a second. But another one is the shift from political fact checking to social media fact checking, debunking fake rumors, fake images, fake content on social media, et cetera. So I'd love to hear people's thoughts about that. I know that Boom Live, Karen, focuses on primarily on social media fact checking. Has political fact checking, has holding public figures, politicians accountable for their public statements, has that faded into the background? And if so, do we need to create space for that? In order to balance these kinds of efforts? What are people's thoughts there? And Karen, let's hear from you first, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, when Thomas was presenting that slide, I found that quite interesting and also almost unbelievable to, as something to process. Because if I look at our own experience in India, I mean, just today we published a fact check on the Prime Minister. So it's vastly different. I think what we need to define here is what are we calling as political fact check? Because one of the things that that we see, if you look at Boom Live's coverage over the past 5 years, a big sort of, if you had to categorize what are we writing about, I think a big chunk of it is politics, and the other chunk of it is communal, and that has to do with religious polarization that you're seeing in India. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there could be other aspects that may not, for example, in India, religion is political. So you have a party, and you have a party at the center which sort of tries to project itself as a vanguard of the majority population in the country, and it attacks the opposition parties, citing this particular point that it uses secularism as a bad word, or it says it's a politically correct term for appeasement. And I think we need to look at this finding in that context, in India especially, there is a sort of blurring of lines when it comes to political claims, and I think there's been a spillover of how these claims surface on social media. So, for example, I think politicians have also wisened up to the fact that there are fact checkers around and who would be listening to their speeches and fact checking them. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going out there and making a claim that's fact checkable or false every single day. But what it does mean is that their proxies or that their surrogates are making claims in a number of other ways which are surfacing on social media. So, that point to me was very interesting.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Joel, I wonder whether you have any view on this from your perch at the Duke Reporters Lab, and especially, is there anything about the design of ClaimReview that means that it's used differently for social media fact checking or political fact checking? It was sort of developed around political fact checking, but now we're seeing it be applied very differently, usually.
Yeah, sure. First, I just want to apologize for the tech issues that we had today, and also commend Thomas for this fantastic research. When I first saw these slides and these dashboards, my face was a mixture of astonishment and amazement, and just complete shock that someone could do something like this with the ClaimReview data. So again, great work, Thomas. Always great to see this. I think what's stunning to me in looking at this chart specifically is that the number of claims that don't mention social media at all has remained relatively stable. And I would say there's even a slight increase in addition to that influx of social media claims. And so I don't know that it's political claims as we know them traditionally taking a backseat as much as it is fact checkers just absorbing this whole other method of factual claims. I think ClaimReview, for the most part, is adequate for describing claims that were made on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, et cetera. Where we saw the opportunity a couple years ago was in those fact checks of memes or visual content, multimedia content. And so working on the development of MediaReview to sort of standardize the way that we talk about those specific types of social media posts. I think that's a tremendous opportunity that we saw because, in part, fact checks of social media content were growing as they were.
Thanks, and that's a perfect segue actually to the other big trend that we've noticed, which is just the increase in output overall. As you point out, it's not that political fact checking has diminished, but just that we have much more fact checking in the world. And we've seen that, that's in the aggregate, but also the output from individual organizations, I think your data suggests, Thomas, has also increased dramatically. So what kinds of questions or concerns does this raise, especially for smaller organizations? Are there challenges related to having the resources and maintaining high quality? Do we effectively need to invest more in supporting the long tail of the fact-checking community? What do people think about the incredible increase in the production of fact checks, both individually and in the aggregate, that we're seeing in this data? And I welcome comments from anyone. Karen, I'll come back to you then as our resident fact checker on the panel. How has Boom Live kept up with this increasing demand? Do you feel challenged doing that, week in and week out?
Sorry, increasing demand in terms of?
Just the incredible surge in output, the number of fact checks being produced by this community and by individual fact checkers like Boom Live.
I think the past year has been crazy, not just for India, but the entire world and the entire fact-checking community. I mean, you had IFCN build the Coronavirus Facts Alliance, and I think over 9,000 fact checks are in that database, and it just goes to show you that when there was a crisis, this community rose up and took on that onus of fact checking all of those claims without losing step and without missing a single beat. So in terms of, you know, the workload that it can absorb, yeah, I mean, it's challenging, and we face different challenges every single day, but I think we've kept up, you know, we've kept pace with the challenge itself.
Thanks, Karen. There's one, you know, we only have a few minutes left, and we want to segue to audience questions as well. But there's one really important question that Thomas's presentation brings up that I'd love to hear you weigh in on, especially Joel, and that's how can we support or incentivize organizations to use ClaimReview more effectively? This data, you know, aggregating it is only as useful as the quality of each individual entry. As Thomas mentioned, he spent, you know, 4 months cleaning up this data. A lot of his thesis describes that in painstaking detail. So how can we improve it? How can we make this an even more useful resource by encouraging groups to use this standard consistently?
Yeah, I would say, as you mentioned, when ClaimReview was first conceived, the idea was how can we get more exposure for fact checks? And so at the time, we weren't really thinking about academic research. That's something that Thomas has helped us see the great potential in. However, it has been a focus of ours to make sure that fact checkers are making ClaimReview and MediaReview to the best effort they can. A large part of my job is working with fact checkers directly and giving them feedback on ClaimReview and giving them tips and publishing documentation for them. I would point people to our website, claimreviewproject.com. You can find some information, tips and best practices there. Also, a quick plug, if I can, I recorded 2 webinars for ClaimReview and MediaReview for Global Fact that are available through the conference. So if you go to the agenda and click on Monday's sessions, there's a webinar page, and you can find a basic overview of ClaimReview and MediaReview that might have some tips to help make better structured data. Totally agree. The work that Thomas did here in standardizing this was monumental. Anything that we can do to help improve the quality so that in the future, less of that manual work has to be done by people who want to use the data is gonna help. I think one of the things that the Facebook third-party fact-checking program does well is that they pay fact checkers for their content and for fact checking on the platform. And so I think we need to explore ways in which we could financially incentivize good ClaimReview, good structured data.
Sure.
Not entirely sure how that would look, but definitely something that I think needs consideration.
And you know, you raise a good point, and we have an audience question about this too, about the role that platforms can play here. Can't Google and Facebook in particular, in addition, you know, Facebook supports the production of fact checks, but isn't there a role for them to play in, you know, in enforcing or incentivizing the more accurate use of ClaimReview? I know Thomas has suggested that maybe some fields could be auto-populated. There can be more guidance in using Google's markup form about the accurate use. You know, so what are sort of technical fixes we can use to nudge more consistent use? And Thomas, feel free to weigh in as well. I know that you've had thoughts about this.
Yeah, so in terms of technical fixes, I think particularly if people are using the markup tool, you know, a lot of errors could be avoided if the markup tool is made a bit smarter. So for instance, if you enter a ClaimReview date which predates the date on which the claim was supposedly made, then clearly that's, you know, unless you're precognizant, then that's impossible. So then the markup tool could say, well, we believe you made an error. Or if you enter Donald J. Trump president, it could say, you know, most fact checkers enter Donald Trump for this. Do you want to change it to Donald Trump? And that would increase the consistency. And I also just want to point out, you know, using ClaimReview more consistently is not just useful for academic researchers like myself, but it also makes the practical applications of ClaimReview for companies like Google and Facebook easier to implement, because at present, the data is so messy that it's also difficult for them to kind of try to do claim matching or to determine, you know, who was actually developed. Yeah, those are my remarks.
Well, I think we have time for about one more question. So here's one that people who maintain data standards, I think, always hate. What fields can we add to ClaimReview to make it more useful? And in particular, we have such good information about the production, right, about the supply side of the fact-checking world. How can we marry this data to other data sets to get a picture of how effective different fact checks have been, or how many people they reach, and so on? I'd love to hear any thoughts about that. How can we really take advantage of this to improve fact checking and to focus our efforts where they're most needed?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and that's one thing which this data really can't show is what is we know how many fact checks each organization published, but what has been the impact of those fact checks? An organization like Full Fact might have more impact through policy initiatives that they do rather than the fact checks themselves. In terms of gauging the actual impact of fact checks, I think it would be very useful, and this has been mentioned a couple of times on this conference, if we had more information from Google, for instance. So if we could not only show, this is a fact check by that organization and they've done that many in that month, but also collectively, these fact checks from that organization have been viewed this many times or have appeared this often in this format or this tool. So yeah, there's a lot of potential additional information that we could collect and kind of integrate with this data to make it even more insightful, I think.
Thanks, everyone. We are just about out of time. Thanks, everyone, for your patience. I'm so glad we had a chance to look at this data in such depth. We have a lot more coming today, including at the end of the day, our featured chat with Tom Rosensteel to wrap up today's Global Facts events. And that's at 3 p.m. New York City time. Have a great Global Fact, everyone. Thanks a lot.